This screencast is designed as preparation for study of Paradise Lost, Book 9, at A-level. The students who will be studying it are studying under the OCR curriculum, but hopefully it is a PowerPoint that will be useful to anybody who may be involved in reading this wonderful work. I've divided my introduction into 3 areas, and in each area there will be little activities to perhaps provoke, stimulate a wish to research further. In fact, there is a need to research further. So we very briefly look at the context of John Milton himself. I want to look at the poem itself and its purpose, I suppose, but also a very quick overview of the poetry that is found within. So we start with John Milton, and I think it's always quite difficult to get a handle, if you like, on the poets that often you are required to read. Milton comes with a degree of baggage. We know he's an epic poet, he's old, to use a phrase much loved of a certain type of student. And in fact, when we look at the fact that he was born in 1608, died in 74, he's a rather remarkable man. He was born during the reign of James I, died during the reign of Charles II, and anybody who does history will know that between that was probably the most tumultuous period in English history. He's a man who lived through the killing of Charles I, perceived by many as regicide and a sin from which there would be little recovery. He lived through the Commonwealth, ruled by Cromwell, and died during the reign of Charles II, a reign that in many ways was typified by great license in behaviour, the reopening of theatres, if you like, the re-establishment of drama and art and music as entertainment, as pleasure. He supported the execution of the king, despite the fact that Charles I, as would have been believed at the time, was anointed by God. The divine right of kings meant that the king was appointed by God to rule the nation. Milton supported the execution of the king. And this is perhaps the element of Milton that we need to look at. Milton as a rebel. Milton as somebody who stood out against authority or convention or established practice if he felt that there was a need to do so. Not only did he support the execution of Charles, but we can see here that in his Middle Ages he wrote some serious work that again would have challenged the orthodoxies by which people lived in the 17th century. He advocated divorce. This was received with great hostility and of course was contrary to the views of the church at the time. Interestingly, for a man who advocated divorce, he was also estranged from his first wife for some 3 years. She came and begged for forgiveness, and as you read the poem, unfortunately we're not reading book 10, but if we were, we would see this even more closely. You might wish to see parallels in the way towards the end of book 9. Adam behaves towards Eve once she has taken of the apple and persuaded Adam to join her. He was a man who wrote tracts in which he supported the idea of the rights of the individual to be free and to make individual decisions. Interestingly, in the work, the Areopagitica, he advocated that evil should be encouraged in the world since it highlights goodness. By opposition, the idea that we can only see evil or recognize evil because it's there, and because we can recognize good, we can compare the two. Again, very important as we begin to look at the arguments put forward by Eve to be allowed to move away from Adam in the Garden of Eden, the event that will lead to her seduction by Satan. Again, you need to just be aware of these works and aware of the ideas that Milton brings into Paradise Lost that he may well be exploring elsewhere in his writing. So, I would suggest that you make a few notes on the trial of Charles I and the restoration that followed the Commonwealth, the attitudes of the people, the prevalent thought processes. Try and do some research on Milton's support for regicide and how regicide would have been perceived at this time. But also, therefore, thinking of the implications of that in relation to Satan, this angel who challenged the orthodoxy that God ruled the heavens. In Paradise Lost, books 1 and 2, Satan is a very persuasive character who portrays God as little more than a tyrant. Likewise, at the time of Milton's birth and through his life, Jacobean kings were often portrayed as arrogant tyrants. Again, is there an element here of Milton the rebel that runs through the characters and the storytelling in Paradise Lost, not just in terms of Satan, but also possibly in terms of Eve? We need to think about that and how that works. So pause now, think about this, make some notes, jot things down, come back when you're ready. Now, in terms of the poetry, as an introduction, I'm not going to go into great detail here, it's worth remembering, in this poem we are reading an epic in the model of Homer or Virgil from the classical tradition, or perhaps of Dante, to use a more recent tradition in terms of Milton's time. It's written in what we call unrhymed iambic pentameter, blank verse. And Milton, being blind, composed this poem orally. I wonder whether this shows, whether we're aware that this is perhaps written by somebody who couldn't see the words on the page and relied largely on sound. It's certainly something that the great poet T.S. Eliot thought when he said that we need to read this poem twice, once for the sounds and once for the meanings, and it's something that I'll come back to at the end of the introduction. Often in Milton's poem, sentence structure is incredibly long and complex. His language use, his syntax, is actually very individual. It often owes more to Latin than to English. He writes with a huge amount of subordination within his sentences, again causing a very long and complex sentence to emerge. He often omits the modals in past tenses, so you get this sort of slightly shocking, almost shorthand writing of past tense. He didn't use punctuation hugely. And when he does use punctuation, he often uses it as an assistance for the reader if reading aloud, rather than necessarily to provide clarity of meaning, let alone to create a special effect by the use perhaps of a dramatic piece of punctuation. All these elements are elements which we will notice in our reading, and they are elements that make Paradise Lost difficult when we first meet it. But as we become used to it, the style becomes second nature. Before we start again, I'd like you to revise and to remind yourselves of the conventions of various poetic forms, iambic pentameter particularly, but also the various metrical feet, the iamb, the trochee, the spondee, and so forth, so that we can use this in conversation unashamedly. If you are somebody who hasn't studied classics, again, you should find yourself some articles on the great classical epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. And I think also a poem by Hesiod. This predates them all, really, in composition. The Theogony, which is essentially Hesiod's version of how the deities in Greek myth came into being. And it's a poem that has a very similar feeling in many ways to Paradise Lost. Having done this, you should also consider why Milton chose to write in epic form. So again, pause, move away, come back when you're ready, and carry on. The poem itself divides into four things: the actual argument of the poem, a look at Satan, a look at feminism, and a look at Book 9 itself. The whole poem is an argument, an explanation for the fall of man. It divides up neatly so that books 1 and 2 look at Satan's motivation for causing mankind to fall. 4 and 8, or 4 to 8 rather, we're in Eden, And we meet Adam and Eve preparing for books 9 and 10, which will show the fall, Eve's temptation, the eating of the fruit, and the fall of Adam. In 10, they do beg for mercy and they're allowed to continue on earth, but sin has introduced death to the world. The two humans are no longer immortal and everybody will die. Now that takes us up to the point where we need to read as far as our reading of this text is concerned. The character of Satan is an interesting character, and he crops up here on the third bullet point. We need to consider whether he's attractive. Certainly William Blake felt that he was. There's a famous quotation that you can find for me about Blake, by Blake on Milton. We look at, as we read book 9, the relationship between Adam and Eve. Why, we wonder, does Eve ask to be allowed to go into the garden alone, and why does Adam let her go? What is Eve's motivation? How is she portrayed? Is she an innocent, or is there something weaker, something more conniving about her? Does the form of the poem help to highlight the moments of great importance, or does it just be an epic form because that's what Milton chose to write? We need to think about these elements closely. I'd like you to look at the poem from a range of views. A feminist perspective is always interesting, viewpoint that began to be prevalent in the second half of the 20th century, where the portrayal of Eve that would have raised few eyebrows in the 17th century might seem to be cruel and vindictive almost. You should also look at this from a Marxist perspective in terms of power and the balance of power and the keeping of power and the prevention of the ordinary individual from ever attaining power, for example. Satan, less heroic in book 9, and interestingly in book 9, where he is portrayed in a variety of wonderfully symbolic ways. He seems to have an awareness of his better nature when he first spies Eve, and we're reminded that he was, of course, an angel. He was simply an angel around God before his fall. And it seems as though Milton is able to look at Eve with him and describe Satan as recognizing his evil. It's an interesting idea, and one that we will need to explore in more depth. Finally, I commented earlier on Eliot. The poem is very complex. It's very difficult. Many think that you need to hear the poem to better understand it and be aware of its beauties. It may well be true. If you want to play with this further, I've recorded a free version, and the sound files are on my blog. There's a link at the foot of this slide. Do please spend some time, go and have a look. The idea here isn't that they are perfect in any way or that they are professional. They are free, and I did spend some time thinking about how I wanted to present them to you. I've divided the poem into 9 sections, conveniently I think, and it will be helpful, I think, just to hear these and get used to the sound world that we are working in. I hope you enjoy working on Paradise Lost. It's a wonderful text, very rewarding, and I look forward to working on it with you. Have fun.